evening. Welcome back to Answers on Eschatology. My name is Dan Derry, and I am the president of the Institute of Fulfilled Eschatology. Welcome back to our study of Matthew 24, and we're going to share some more thoughts on the phrase "this generation" in this video. Now, we're demonstrating that the phrase "this generation" actually meant Jesus' first century generation, and we're doing that from Scripture alone. We're not looking at the Greek word genea. We are using biblical hermeneutics from Scripture to interpret Jesus's phrase "this generation" as referring to his first century generation. And the way we did that in the last video is we just used Jesus's own interpretation. We showed you that every single time Jesus used the phrase "this generation" outside of the Olivet Discourses, which is 13 times in the Gospels, that he was referring to his first century contemporary generation every single time. And here's the fact. I didn't bring it out last video, but I'm doing it now, and it's going to tie in with this video. In every one of those instances, the phrase "this generation" is couched in the context of judgment. Every single one. And you'll notice if you search that out for yourself, Mark 8, the phrase "this generation" in Mark 8 is not placed, it's not couched in judgment. But when you look at its parallel text in Matthew 15 and 16, you'll see that this generation is in fact couched in the context of judgment. So listen, when we get to Matthew 24 and its parallel text, Luke 21, Mark 13, and the phrase "this generation," we have no biblical right, no biblical precedent, no biblical authority to interpret it differently than how Jesus interpreted it throughout his entire ministry, especially since Matthew 24:34 is couched in the context of Jerusalem's judgment, Israel's judgment in AD 70. That's a powerful, powerful fact. Every single time Jesus uses that phrase in the Gospels, number one, it refers to his first century generation, and number two, it refers to the judgment of his first century generation. Okay, so watch this. This is where I'm going in this video. I want to go to Matthew 23 and Matthew 24 and show you that this generation in Matthew 24 was simply the fulfillment of the judgment that he predicted in Matthew 23 to come upon his own generation. Watch this. And before we get into this, let me just make this simple point. We are going to look at what is called an inclusio. In Matthew 23:36, Jesus uses the phrase "this generation." In Matthew 24, Jesus uses the phrase "this generation." He is doing what's called an enveloping or bookending or an inclusio. And he's using, it's a literary device where you use similar words or similar phrase at both ends of a discourse or a speech or something. And by doing that, you emphasize what's in between those two bookends. And what's in between those two bookends is emphasized, and it relates to the actual inclusio. In other words, this generation is used in Matthew 23, this generation is used in Matthew 24. Well, the whole context refers to, and it has to do with, this generation. Okay? And we're going to prove that by doing a comparison between Matthew 23 and Matthew 24. And we're going to show you that these are one and the same judgments that Jesus prophesied to come upon his generation in both Matthew 23 and Matthew 24. And he formed it as an inclusio to emphasize that point. Now watch this. Here's the parallels, okay? Matthew 23:38, Jesus says, "Your house is being left to you desolate." Matthew 24:2, Jesus says, "Not one stone will be left upon another that will not be thrown down." That's their house being left to them desolate. Next parallel, Matthew 23:34, Jesus tells the Jews of his day that he's going to send them scribes, he's going to send them apostles and prophets, and you're going to kill and crucify some of them. Matthew 24:9, we got the flip side of that. Jesus tells his prophets and apostles and his disciples that some of those Jews are going to deliver you to persecution and kill you, okay? So it's the outworking of what he already prophesied to take place. Next parallel, Matthew 23:35, Jesus says, "Upon you will fall the guilt of all the righteous blood shed upon the earth." Well, in Matthew 21, we have the Great Tribulation. That would be the time of Jacob's trouble. According to Daniel 12, it would be the time of great distress upon Israel, such as it has never been, nor would be, since there was creation. And if we parallel that with Luke 21, 20 to 24, we understand that that was the days of vengeance when great wrath would be upon God's people. Now watch this. In Matthew 23, Jesus told them that the guilt of all the righteous blood will come upon them. And Luke 21, it's the days of vengeance. But watch this. The days of vengeance, according to the Old Testament prophets, Deuteronomy 32, Isaiah 59, the vengeance of the Lord, the day of vengeance will come upon Israel for their shedding the blood of the righteous. That's what was taking place in Luke 21, and it's parallel in Matthew 24. Perfect parallel with Matthew 23:35. Next parallel, Matthew 23:37, Jesus says, I wanted to gather your children together, but you would not. And in Matthew 24:31, Jesus says he'll send forth his angels with a sound of a trumpet, and they will gather together his elect. See, the gathering that the Jews rejected, the elect would receive. Okay? Again, it's the outworking of this prophecy in Matthew 23. Next parallel, Matthew 23:39, Jesus says, you will not see me until. Well, that's the coming of the Son of Man. See, they're not going to perceive that coming of the Son of Man unless they do something. And in Matthew 24:30, obviously we have the coming of the Son of Man. Those who pierced him would see him. And of course, those who were eagerly waiting him would see him. Okay, so we have the coming of the Son of Man in both texts. And finally, in Matthew 23:36, Jesus says, all these things will come upon this generation. And in Matthew 24, Jesus says, this generation will not pass away until all these things, the same phrase, take place. What we have here is perfect parallel of elements. In both Matthew 23 and Matthew 24, we have their house being left with them desolate. We have the killing of the apostles and prophets of Jesus. We have the guilt of all the bloodshed upon the earth coming upon Old Covenant Israel in the day of vengeance, in the day of the Lord's fierce wrath and anger. We have the gathering of the elect, and we have the rejection of those who refuse to be gathered. We have the coming of the Son of Man, and all this is placed in Jesus' generation. Once again, just like every other text in the Gospels, this generation is couched in the context of judgment, specifically the judgment of Jesus' generation. And Jesus bookends. He makes this judgment in Matthew 23 and 24 in Inclusio, which emphasizes that judgment was to take place in his generation. There is no way around it, ladies and gentlemen. This generation in Matthew 24:34 refers to the judgment of Old Covenant Jerusalem in Jesus' generation. And we got lots more to say. We'll pick it up next time, and we'll begin to look at the Old Testament prophetic source for Jesus' words, his phrase, this generation. That is an amazing study, and we'll do it next time on Answers on Eschatology. Bye for now.